It's January, and your garden is frozen or dormant, so you're assuming there's nothing to do until spring thaw, right? Wrong. You're sitting on the single most critical month for locking in food production that'll pay you back for the next 10 to 20 years, and you're wasting it by waiting for tomato planting season like everyone else. Here's the reality. There are 7 specific perennial crops you can prepare right now that will establish deep roots during dormancy, explode with growth in spring, and deliver 3 times the harvest of any annual crop you've ever planted. This isn't a gardening hobby. This is food infrastructure, and January is the only month you can lock it in. You're doing it backwards. Every spring, you're buying annual crops that live for one season, die in the fall, and force you to start over from zero. You're spending money on seedlings, spending weekends transplanting and watering, spending summer fighting the same pest problems, and spending fall cleaning up dead plants so you can repeat the cycle next year. It's a labor trap disguised as a hobby. Think about it. When you buy a tomato seedling in March and stick it in warm soil, that plant has maybe 4 months to establish roots, flower, fruit, and die before fall. Frost kills it. Racing against time from day one. You're watering constantly, fertilizing weekly, praying it doesn't get hit by hornworms or blight before you get a harvest. That's the annual model. High input, short window, single season return. You're gardening like you're running a sprint when you should be setting up systems that run themselves. But here's what most people miss about perennial design. When you plant asparagus crowns in January, those roots have 3 full months of cool, moist conditions to spread out and establish before the plant even thinks about producing spears. By the time summer heat arrives, you've got a root system 2 feet deep that can access water and nutrients annuals can't even reach. That same asparagus bed will produce for 20 years. 1 winter of prep work equals 2 decades of spring harvest. You never replant. You never buy seedlings. You never start over. Meanwhile, your neighbor is buying tomato plants every single March and wondering why gardening feels like a part-time job. Here's the reality. January planting isn't about immediate gratification. It's about front-loading the work so the system runs itself for years. Indigenous growers understood this. They didn't plant monocultures of annuals that required constant intervention. They planted perennial staples that worked through observation and relationships instead of labor and inputs. Now let's talk about the first perennial that'll transform how you think about food production: asparagus. This is the crop that makes people understand the difference between annual thinking and perennial design. You plant bare root asparagus crowns in January, which cost about $3 each if you order them now instead of waiting for garden center markups in spring. Dig a trench 8 inches deep, spread the roots, cover them, mulch heavily, walk away. That's it. First year, you let them establish. Second year, you might harvest a few spears, but mostly you're letting the plant build energy. Third year and beyond, you're cutting asparagus every single day in spring for 6 to 8 weeks straight. 1 10-foot row of asparagus crowns planted this January will produce 30 pounds of spears per year for the next 20 years. That's 600 pounds of asparagus from 1 weekend of January work. Compare that to buying asparagus at the grocery store for $5 a pound, and you'll understand why perennials aren't just a gardening choice. They're a financial decision. But here's what makes January critical. Asparagus crowns need to be planted while they're dormant. If you wait until March, they've already started breaking dormancy, and transplant shock kills half of them. January is the window. Miss it, and you're waiting another full year. Second perennial, rhubarb. This one's almost absurdly low maintenance. You plant a rhubarb crown in January, mulch it, forget about it until April when you'll see massive leaves emerging. Rhubarb thrives on neglect. It doesn't want fertilizer. It doesn't want constant attention. It wants to be left alone in slightly acidic soil with decent drainage. And in return, it'll give you 10 to 15 pounds of stalks per plant every spring for 15 years or more. You're not watering it after the first season because those roots go down 3 feet. You're not fighting pests because rhubarb leaves are toxic to most insects. You're not replanting because the crown just keeps expanding. One rhubarb plant costs about $8 if you buy a bare root crown in January. By year 3, that plant is producing enough stalks that you're making pies, jams, and rhubarb compote all spring, and you're still giving excess harvest to neighbors. Here's what most people miss. Rhubarb planted in January establishes roots during the cold season, when there's no competition from weeds, no heat stress, no pest pressure. It's just quietly building the underground infrastructure that'll support decades of harvest. The math is absurd. $8, 1 hour of planting, 15 years of production. Meanwhile, people are spending $40 on tomato seedlings every spring and wondering why their grocery bill never goes down. Think about it. You've already spent more time this year scrolling through seed catalogs than it would take to plant both asparagus and rhubarb. These aren't complicated crops. They're not finicky. They don't require special skills or expensive infrastructure. They require one decision. Are you going to keep replanting annuals every spring? Or are you going to spend one January installing perennials that pay you back for decades? This is where most gardeners get stuck. They've been conditioned by garden centers to think in terms of spring planting season, which is exactly when the stores want you buying products. But here's the reality. Experienced growers know that January is the real planting season for anything that matters long term. Bare root stock is cheap, available, and dormant, which means transplant success rates are dramatically higher than spring planting. You're working with biology instead of fighting it. Now let's talk about the crops that actually work together, because this is where perennial design separates itself from the annual monoculture trap you've been stuck in. Garden centers want you buying one type of plant per bed because it's simple to market and easy to upsell. Tomatoes in this bed, peppers in that bed, herbs over there, each one requiring its own fertilizer schedule, its own pest management, its own watering routine. You're managing 5 separate systems when you could be managing one integrated system that does the work for you. Think about it. Indigenous growers figured this out centuries ago. They didn't plant monocultures. They planted polycultures where each plant serves multiple functions and the combination creates a self-regulating ecosystem that requires almost no intervention. Here's your third perennial, blueberry bushes, but not the way garden centers tell you to plant them. You're going to pair them with nitrogen-fixing ground cover and pest-deterrent herbs so the system feeds and protects itself. Standard advice says buy peat moss, install drip irrigation, cover the bushes with netting every June. That's the expensive, labor-intensive approach that keeps you dependent on inputs. But here's the systems approach. Plant your blueberry bushes in January while they're bare root and dormant. Then immediately interplant white clover as a living mulch around the base. White clover fixes nitrogen from the air and deposits it in the soil through root nodules. Your blueberries get free fertilizer without you buying bags of synthetic nitrogen. The clover stays low, shades out competing weeds, retains soil moisture, so you're watering maybe once a week instead of daily. Now add chives or garlic chives planted in a ring around each blueberry bush. These alliums release sulfur compounds that deter aphids, Japanese beetles, and other pests that would normally target your berries. You've just created a 3-layer system. Blueberries for fruit production, clover for nitrogen and weed suppression, alliums for pest management. One planting session in January, and the system maintains itself for 10 to 15 years while producing 20 pounds of berries per bush annually. But here's what most people miss about berry monocultures. If you plant 3 blueberry bushes of the same variety in a row with bare soil between them, you're creating ideal conditions for fungal disease. Powdery mildew, botrytis, anthracnose, they all thrive in monocultures with exposed soil and poor air circulation. Garden centers will sell you fungicide sprays to manage these problems. You're spending money every season fighting diseases your design created. This might shock you, but polycultures eliminate most disease pressure naturally. When you interplant clover and alliums, you're increasing biodiversity, improving air circulation at ground level, disrupting the pathogen life cycles that depend on finding the same host plant repeatedly. Observation-based growers know this. They don't spray. They design systems where disease can't establish in the first place. Here's your fourth perennial. Perennial onions, specifically Egyptian walking onions or potato onions. These are the crops that make people realize how much money they're wasting on grocery store produce. You plant onion sets in January. They multiply underground through the season, and by fall, you're harvesting bulbs while leaving some in the ground to regrow next year. One $20 investment in onion sets gives you a permanent onion patch that produces 40 to 60 pounds annually with zero replanting. You're never buying onions at the store again. You're never starting onion seeds indoors in February. You're never transplanting seedlings in March. You plant once, harvest forever, and the population expands naturally year after year. This is food sovereignty in the most literal sense. You've broken dependency on the supply chain for one of the most commonly used vegetables in your kitchen. But here's where it gets interesting. Egyptian walking onions produce both underground bulbs and topset bulbils, which are small onions that form at the top of the flower stalk. When those topsets get heavy enough, the stalk bends over and plants them a foot away from the parent plant. The onions literally walk across your garden bed, expanding the colony without any effort from you. This might sound like a novelty, but think about the long-term implication. You plant 10 onion sets in January. By year 3, you have 50 plants spreading across a 4-foot area. By year 5, you're giving onion starts to neighbors because you have more than you can use. That's what perennial design does. It turns scarcity into abundance through time and observation instead of money and labor. Now let's talk about your fifth perennial. And this is where it gets interesting for people with limited space or HOA restrictions. Perennial herbs, specifically oregano, thyme, and sage. These aren't just flavor additions. They're functional landscape plants that happen to be edible, which means you can plant them as ground cover, border plants, or even container specimens, and nobody's going to complain that you're growing food in the front yard. Oregano planted in January spreads into a dense mat that suppresses weeds, smells incredible when you walk past it, produces enough leaves that you're drying bundles for winter use. One plant becomes 20 through division over 3 years. Thyme works similarly. It's evergreen in most climates, stays low enough to plant between stepping stones, survives on rainfall alone after the first season. Sage grows into a woody shrub that deer won't touch, butterflies love, and produces leaves year-round in mild climates. These 3 herbs planted together create a Mediterranean microclimate in your yard that requires zero maintenance and produces more herbs than you'd spend $200 buying fresh at the grocery store over 5 years. But here's the real advantage. Perennial herbs are gateway plants for convincing skeptical family members or HOA boards that food production doesn't mean turning your yard into a farm. You're not growing vegetables. You're installing attractive, drought-tolerant landscaping that happens to be useful. Once people see how well these perennials perform compared to annual flowers that die every winter, they start asking what else you can grow that works the same way. That's how you scale from 3 herb plants to a full perennial food forest over time. Your 6th perennial is strawberries, but not the way most people grow them. Standard strawberry advice says plant them in neat rows, replace them every 3 years, fight slugs all season. That's annual thinking applied to a perennial crop. Here's the systems approach. Plant ever-bearing strawberry crowns in January, let them establish through spring, then allow runners to fill in the bed naturally so you create a dense strawberry mat that shades out weeds and self-propagates indefinitely. One flat of 20 strawberry crowns costs about $30 and will expand into 200 plants over 3 years through runner production. You're looking at 50 to 80 pounds of berries annually from a 4x8 bed after year 2, and the bed maintains itself through natural runner replacement. Old plants die, new runners take their place, and you're harvesting continuously from May through October without replanting anything. But here's what most people miss about January planting. Strawberries planted in January have 12 weeks to develop deep root systems before they put energy into flowering. Compare that to strawberries planted in March, which immediately start flowering because soil temperatures trigger bloom cycles, and those plants produce weak harvests the first year because they're trying to fruit before establishing strong roots. January planting gives you a full-strength harvest by June of the same year. Now let's talk about adapting this for small spaces, because strawberries prove you don't need land to build perennial food systems. You can grow them in hanging baskets, tower systems, or 5-gallon buckets just as successfully as in-ground beds. If you've got a balcony or patio and you're thinking perennial food production isn't possible for you, this is where that assumption breaks down. 3 5-gallon buckets with drainage holes, filled with quality potting mix, planted with ever-bearing strawberry crowns in January, will produce 20 pounds of berries per season for 5 years before you need to refresh the soil and divide the plants. That's 100 pounds of organic strawberries from 3 buckets over 5 years. Calculate what that costs at the grocery store, and you'll understand why perennials aren't a gardening hobby. They're a wealth-building strategy. Now let's talk about your 7th perennial. And this one surprises people because most Americans berry. Elderberry bushes planted in January will grow 10 feet tall, produce massive clusters of berries by year 2, and continue producing for 25 years with zero maintenance beyond occasional pruning. One bush produces 15 to 20 pounds of berries annually, which you process into syrup, jam, or wine. The flowers are edible and make excellent fritters or tea. The entire plant is a pharmacy and a food source combined, and it grows so aggressively that your main job is keeping it from taking over the whole yard. Elderberry costs about $12 for a bare root plant in January. By year 3, you're harvesting enough berries that you're not buying cold medicine all winter because elderberry syrup is one of the most effective immune support remedies available. This is food as medicine. This is one plant doing the work of an entire supplement cabinet. But here's where modern constraints come in. You're thinking you don't have space for 10-foot elderberry bushes and asparagus beds and blueberry hedges. You've got a small yard, or you're renting, or you've got an HOA that loses their mind if you plant anything taller than a marigold. Here's the reality. Every single perennial I've mentioned can be adapted for containers, small spaces, or restrictive regulations. And the biology works exactly the same whether you're growing in a quarter-acre food forest or 3 pots on a balcony. Asparagus grows in 20-gallon fabric pots. Blueberries thrive in 15-gallon containers with acidic potting mix. Rhubarb needs 1 large container and a shady corner. Perennial onions work in window boxes. The size of your space doesn't determine whether you can build perennial food systems. Your willingness to think in terms of vertical growing, container adaptation, and ornamental edible hybrids determines that. Now let's talk about what this means for water management, because this might be the most significant advantage perennials have over annuals, and nobody talks about it. Annual crops have shallow root systems, typically 6 to 12 inches deep, which means they depend entirely on frequent surface watering. If you skip 2 days of watering tomatoes in July, they wilt. If you skip 4 days, they die. You're a slave to the watering schedule all summer because annuals can't access deep soil moisture. Meanwhile, perennials work completely differently. By the end of year 1, asparagus roots are 18 inches deep. By year 3, they're 36 inches deep, accessing moisture from soil layers that stay damp even during drought. Blueberry roots penetrate 2 to 3 feet. Rhubarb goes deeper. These plants are tapping into water reserves. Annuals don't even know exist, which means after the first establishment year, you're watering maybe once every 2 weeks during dry periods instead of every other day. Think about it. Calculate the time savings. Calculate the water bill reduction. A mature perennial garden uses 1/10 the water of an annual vegetable garden, producing equivalent food volume. You're not just saving time. You're saving hundreds of dollars in water costs over the life of these plants. Here's what most people miss about perennial establishment. Year 1 feels like you're doing more work than annuals because you're prepping beds, amending soil, mulching heavily, and paying attention to watering schedules while roots develop. That initial investment tricks people into thinking perennials are high maintenance. But you're front-loading the work. Year 2, maintenance drops by half. Year 3, you're doing almost nothing except harvesting. By year 5, you're walking through the garden once a week to pick food, and that's it. Meanwhile, annual gardeners are doing the same amount of work in year 5 that they did in year 1 because the system resets every season. They're still buying seedlings, transplanting, watering daily, fighting pests, replacing dead plants. The workload never decreases. That's the trap. Now let's address the objection I know you're thinking. This sounds expensive. 7 different perennial crops, bare root stock, soil amendments, mulch, containers if you need them. You're adding up costs in your head and assuming this is a rich person hobby. But here's the math. Asparagus crowns, 15 plants at $3 each, $45. Rhubarb crown, $8. Blueberry bushes, 3 bare root plants at $12 each, $36. White clover seed for ground cover, $10. Perennial onion sets, $20 for 50 sets. Strawberry crowns, $30 for a flat of 20. Elderberry bare root, $12. Perennial herbs, 3 plants at $6 each, $18. Total investment, $179. That's less than most people spend taking their family to dinner twice. And this isn't an annual expense. This is one-time infrastructure that produces food for 10 to 25 years, depending on the crop. Calculate the return. Asparagus alone produces 600 pounds over 20 years. At $5 per pound grocery store pricing, that's $3,000 of food from a $45 investment. The entire system pays for itself in year 2 and generates tens of thousands of dollars worth of food over the lifespan of the plants. But here's what nobody tells you. You don't even need to spend that much if you're willing to propagate from cuttings or divisions. Every gardener with established perennial beds has more plant material than they need. Rhubarb crowns divide naturally every 4 years. Berry bushes produce suckers. Strawberries send out runners. Perennial onions multiply underground. If you know one person with a mature perennial garden, you can get free starts of almost everything on this list just by asking. That's how indigenous growing systems worked. Nobody was buying plants from commercial nurseries. They were sharing, dividing, and propagating within communities. You're not building a garden. You're joining a network of people who understand that food security comes from relationships with plants and people, not from dependence on supply chains. Here's the identity shift that happens when you transition from annual to perennial thinking. You stop being a seasonal gardener who starts over every year. You become a systems designer who observes, adjusts, and improves long-term infrastructure. You're not asking what to plant this spring. You're asking what combination of perennials will create a self-regulating ecosystem that produces abundant food with minimal intervention for the next 2 decades. That's a completely different question, and it leads to completely different results. You're designing food security, not maintaining a hobby. And January is the only month where you can lock this in, because that's when bare root stock is available, dormant plants can handle transplant stress, and roots can establish before heat arrives. Every week you wait past February, your success rate drops. This is the window. You're either using it to install perennials that'll feed you for decades, or you're waiting until March to buy tomato seedlings like everyone else. Next summer, you'll be harvesting asparagus, rhubarb, berries, onions, herbs, and elderflowers while your neighbors are watering their annual vegetables twice a day and wondering why gardening never gets easier. That's the difference design makes.